I'm going to try to record a relatively brief prophecy update. I was out of town. I apologize for not getting one up on Sunday, but Pam and I were out of town at a family event. My nephew was being ordained to the ministry at his church up in the Detroit area, so we couldn't be available. It was a year ago today that I was actually in Jerusalem and did a prophecy update with Brian Schrager and Bill Koenig on the day, 2 days before President Trump came and made his visit. It's hard to believe with the things that have transpired in the last year that it was only a year ago. Sometimes it seems like 4 or 5 years have gone by. We filmed that prophecy update from south of the old city of Jerusalem, from this location, looking up towards the old city, up through the valley. You can kind of get an idea of the layout of the city of Jerusalem. You see the Mount of Olives in the upper right-hand corner. We filmed it from a place known as the Promenade. It's also right next to the UN building that they've used for many years, and it's actually located on something that was called the Hill of Evil Council, kind of appropriate with the UN involved. You might want to, if you want to look at that and see what we were talking about a year ago in Jerusalem, you could look that up on the Fellowship Bible Chapel YouTube channel. We talk each week about the convergence of events, and certainly it was another one of those weeks. I'm going to cover a couple cultural things very quickly. Then I'm going to move into focusing on the things that transpired in Jerusalem and the Middle East, and something that I think might have some pretty serious prophetic implications relative to a meeting that took place on Friday in Istanbul. So we'll cover that at the end. This is an interesting article in the new issue of The Atlantic. It's called How the Enlightenment Ends, and it's by Henry Kissinger. It's interesting that he writes this when he looks at artificial intelligence and where he thinks that this may be heading. He's not very comfortable with it. Now, I know that might surprise some of you, but he wrote, here's just something that he wrote. The age of reason originated the thoughts and actions that shaped the contemporary world order. But that order is now in upheaval amid a new, even more sweeping technological revolution whose consequences we have failed to fully reckon with, and whose culmination may be a world relying on machines powered by data and algorithms and ungoverned by ethical or philosophical norms. It's very interesting that he says this, given his position. He thinks that artificial intelligence will lead to many unintended results. I think that we would agree with that people think this is going to be the be-all and end-all, and essentially what it may have the opportunity to do if it's allowed to run its course is actually destroy humanity. There was another school shooting this week. I'll try to maybe talk about that a little bit later. There were some good articles. There's an older article from a few years ago by Malcolm Gladwell. It was cited by David French in an article over at National Review. And one of the things that they talk about is that, everybody wants to focus on it's the guns, but that this seems to be an increasing problem. It appears to be happening with greater frequency, and both Gladwell and David French are not very optimistic about the direction that this is going. Part of it is based on this. This is a study that was cited in The Independent, a UK newspaper, about over 8 years ago, that fame was now the career choice for over half of the 16-year-olds that were surveyed. I think that that's probably only grown in the meantime. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but they asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And a lot of them just say, I want to be a celebrity. I want to be famous. They don't care what they're famous for. They just want to be famous. That really kind of says a lot that's not so good about our culture and where we're heading. In 1 Timothy 4, the Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy, talked about days like this. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron. And we cite these verses many times, this verse and others that talk about this time at the end where people will be departing from the, not only from the faith, but just departing from truth and giving themselves over to fables. And I think we see that one of the examples of that is, this is an article from the Sun Herald in Australia, banned the books, counsels gender war to hit kinders and libraries. So look at this. This is what this article, which was published today, says. Victorian councils are auditing libraries, schools, and kindergarten and urging a ban on the terms boy and girl in a bid to teach children as young as 3 to have gender equitable relationships. Melbourne City Council is among a number of local authorities responding to radical new research suggesting educators should avoid classifying kids by gender and boys and girls only activities, avoid comments defining what females or males do or should do, and avoid using the terms boys and girls, and minimize the extent to which gender is labeled. The Australian National University research, published in March, studied how children are influenced by gender stereotyping and found prejudice among race and gender lines can be observed in children as young as 3 to 4 years of age. Educational resources suggest educators apply a gender lens to programs and materials, such as by reviewing books to ensure a range of different stories and experiences beyond gender stereotypical narratives. Teachers are told not to select boys in gendered colors and to not use expressions such as boys will be boys. Well, I think we can see where this is heading. The speech police are going to be all over this. With regard to the Iran deal, just a couple of comments. I'll have a couple more comments near the end of this talk. But there was this report in The Guardian about 2 weeks ago that one of the Iran deal supporters was told he was a Trump target. This was Ben Rhodes and another person. They were supposedly investigated to get some background research on them to maybe attack them because they might have been financially interested in the Iranian deal. So the fact that they were investigated by someone was very troubling to especially the New York Times talked about it. Here's just a little report from PBS about that.
John Yang now has the strange tale of how and why 2 Obama administration staffers who helped to shape the pact are suddenly back in focus.
Amna, it's been nearly 3 years since the Iran deal was sealed, but this weekend, the British newspaper The Guardian reported that last year, 2 top Obama White House national security officials who helped negotiate the agreement, Ben Rhodes and Colin Kahl, were the targets of elaborate efforts to delegitimize it. The newspaper said an Israeli private intelligence firm tried to dig up information that might discredit the 2 men.
Well, it was interesting that what happened in this situation, too, was that the New York Times reported that this investigator, this Black Cube company that was hired, was actually connected to the Likud party. That's Benjamin Netanyahu's party in Israel. It turns out that that was not true, and in fact, the New York Times has published a rather long correction to that article, specifically noting that the article also inaccurately linked the foundation to Israel's Likud party. While the think tank does align with some of Likud's positions, it is not directly involved with the party. One commentator noted that at the rate that the Times is making corrections to the article, eventually the corrections to the article will be longer than the article was originally. It's just interesting, sort of the hypocrisy that is involved here, where this ongoing Trump administration the investigation of the Trump administration continues. It's been ongoing for over a year now, and somebody looks into the background of Ben Rhodes and one of the other supporters of the Iran deal, and they everybody gets all upset about that. Well, let's look a little bit about what happened this week in the Middle East. I want to first look at some background information. I pulled out some old quotes from an article written by Shimon Peres back about 20 years ago. Not an article, a book called Tomorrow is Now. I want you to listen to what he said then about some things related to the peace process. The establishment of a Palestinian state means the inflow of combat-ready Palestinian forces, more than 25,000 men under arms, into Judea and Samaria. This force, together with the local youth, will double itself in a short time. It will not be short of weapons or other military equipment. In a short space of time, an infrastructure for waging war will be set up in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. Israel will have problems in preserving day-to-day security, which may drive the country into war or undermine the morale of its citizens. That's from page 232 of Tomorrow is Now, written roughly 20 years ago. He continued in that book, in time of war, the frontiers of the Palestinian state will constitute an excellent staging point for mobile forces to mount attacks on infrastructure installations vital for Israel's existence, to impede the freedom of action of the Israeli Air Force in the skies over Israel, and to cause bloodshed among the population in areas adjacent to the frontier line. Now, this is interesting coming from Shimon Peres, who was one of the main proponents for the creation of a two-state solution later in his life. This article was published by Dr. Martin Sherman about 2 months ago, and it said, Arab Palestine and a safe Israel are mutually exclusive. Here's what Dr. Sherman said in that article. Once Israel evacuates the strategically vital highlands of Judea Samaria to facilitate the establishment of an Arab state, there is no way that Israel can have secure and defensible borders, for there's no way that it can ensure that they will not fall into the very hands of those who seek its destruction, including elements controlled by the terror puppet masters in Tehran. And I'll have a little bit more to say about what's going on with Iran later. The big news of the week, of course, Trump withdrew the United States from the Iranian deal, and then on May 14th, a week ago today, they had a big celebration in Jerusalem to recognize the opening of the United States Embassy. It was a time of great celebration in Israel. This is the Friends of Zion Museum. Trump is a friend of Zion. There were pictures. They have a system now where they can project laser lights and that sort of thing on the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. They did it last year when we were there for the 50th anniversary of the victory in the Six-Day War. On the left there, you see the municipal building with the Israeli and American banners. This was the headline in the New York Post this year in Jerusalem. This was the culmination of a lot of people's prayers and thoughts and hopes that here, as you'll hear in the clips that I'm going to play for you in just a moment, people have been dreaming of this for a long time. This was the official, in many respects, considered to be the official recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, something that had not been recognized in modern times by anyone. It started on December 6th when President Trump issued his proclamation, and it culminated about 6 months later in the embassy actually opening in Jerusalem. Now I'm going to play you about a 9-minute clip of the ceremony, clips of the ceremony and the different people that participated. I tried to pick out what I thought would be the highlights. It was about an hour-and-a-half ceremony. You can find it on the White House YouTube channel. But here's just about 9 minutes of highlights of the ceremony, starting with a prayer, opening prayer by Dr. Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist in Dallas.
Heavenly Father, we come before you, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, thanking you for bringing us to this momentous occasion in the life of your people and in the history of our world. 4,000 years ago, you said to your servant Abraham that you would make him the father of a great nation, a nation through whom the whole world would be blessed. And Father, we are also grateful as we think about what happened 70 years ago today, at this very moment, when you fulfilled the prophecies of the prophets from thousands of years ago and regathered your people in this promised land. And now today, Father, we want to pray what the psalmist prayed 3,000 years ago. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love her prosper. May peace dwell within her walls. And we pray this in the name and the spirit of the Prince of Peace, Jesus our Lord. Amen.
This city and its entire nation is a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the Jewish people. The United States will always be a great friend of Israel and a partner in the cause of freedom and peace.
On behalf of the 45th President of the United States of America, we welcome you officially and for the first time to the Embassy of the United States here in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Thank you.
In December of last year, President Trump announced to the world that the United States would finally recognize the truth, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Iran's aggression threatens the many peace-loving citizens throughout the region and the entire world. From Israel to Jordan to Egypt to Saudi Arabia and beyond, many leaders are fighting to modernize their countries and create better lives for their people. In confronting common threats and in pursuit of common interests, previously unimaginable opportunities and alliances are emerging. I am also proud to be here today as a member of the team that President Trump has entrusted to lead the efforts to bring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. As we have seen from the protests of the last month and even today, those provoking violence are part of the problem and not part of the solution. The United States is prepared to support a peace agreement in every way that we can. We believe that it is possible for both sides to gain more than they give so that all people can live in peace, safe from danger, free from fear, and able to pursue their dreams. The United States recognizes the sensitivity surrounding Jerusalem, a city that means so much to so many. Jerusalem is a city unique in the history of civilization. No other place on earth can claim significance to three major religions. Each day, Jews pray at the Western Wall, Muslims bow in prayer at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Christians worship at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That is why President Trump has called many times, including right now, on all parties to maintain the status quo at Jerusalem's holy sites, including the Temple Mount, also known as Haram al-Sharif. When there is peace in this region, we will look back upon this day and remember that the journey to peace started with a strong America recognizing the truth. The pursuit of peace is the noblest pursuit of humankind. I believe peace is within reach if we dare to believe that the future can be different from the past, that we are not condemned to relive history, and that the way things were is not how they must forever be. It will not be an easy road, and it will be filled with difficult moments and tough decisions, but if we dream big, if we lead with courage, we can change the trajectory for millions from hopeless to boundless. Today, we take another historic step in that direction. I am confident that as a result, our nations will be stronger, our peoples more prosperous, and our futures filled with even greater promise for peace. May God bless you. May God bless Israel. May God bless the United States of America.
Dear friends, what a glorious day Remember this moment. This is history. President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. And I'll tell you that I spent the first 3 years of my life in this neighborhood and in Getty Street in Talpiot, which is not very far away. There were a few charming houses here, many open fields. I remember ambling in these fields with my brother Yoni. He was 6, I was 3. He held my hand very tight. We'd walk to this wondrous house of Professor Joseph Klausner, the renowned Jewish historian, who was my father's teacher. I used to peer through the slats of the wooden synagogue where he and the great Israeli writer Shai Agnon used to pray on Shabbat. And David, I would approach this place right here, but only so far, because my mother told me, you can't go any further. This was near the border. It was exposed to sniper fire. That was then. This is now. Today, the embassy of the most powerful nation on earth, our greatest ally, the United States of America, today its embassy opened here. So for me, this spot brings back personal memories, but for our people, it evokes profound collective memories of the greatest moments we have known on this city on a hill. In Jerusalem, Abram passed the greatest test of faith and the right to be the father of our nation. In Jerusalem, King David established our capital 3,000 years ago. In Jerusalem, King Solomon built our temple, which stood for many centuries. In Jerusalem, Jewish exiles from Babylon rebuilt the temple, which stood for many more centuries. In Jerusalem, the Maccabees rededicated that temple and restored Jewish sovereignty in this land. And it was here in Jerusalem, some 2,000 years later, that the soldiers of Israel spoke 3 immortal words: Har Habayit Be'adenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. Words that lifted the spirit of the entire nation. We are in Jerusalem and we are here to stay. We gather here today to celebrate another historic day in the life of this city, which I know will take its place alongside other momentous decisions in the history of our people. Over a century ago, the Balfour Declaration recognized the right of the Jewish people to a national home in this land. And exactly 70 years ago today, President Truman became the first world leader to recognize the newborn Jewish state. Last December, President Trump became the first world leader to recognize Jerusalem as our capital. And today, the United States of America is opening its embassy right here in Jerusalem. Thank you, President Trump, for having the courage to keep your promises.
Well, it was a pretty moving ceremony. It was very well done. Just a couple things to note from Jared Kushner's speech, the desire for peace in that region, the desire for peace in Israel. And then from Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech, the centrality of the temple to the Jewish people in Jerusalem. You'll note that he mentioned when it was built, when it was rededicated by the Maccabees, and when the Temple Mount was retaken in 1967 during the Six-Day War. I think those are a couple of the key things to pay attention to: the desire for peace and the desire for a temple. We know that those are critical markers of the end times. Well, there was quite a bit of reaction to that ceremony. The Gulf News from the United Arab Emirates called it a sad day, said it was a flagrant and hostile act by America. There was a tremendous number of articles, front page of the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, contrasting the ceremony in Jerusalem with the protests that were taking place down along the border at Gaza. There were over 60 Palestinians killed in those protests. People said that it was not fair. The Europeans claimed that the use of violence was disproportionate, and I'm not sure what a proportionate response is to someone who's throwing stones at you with a velocity that can kill you, throwing Molotov cocktails, trying to get through the border fence, and with the stated purpose of going in and killing Jews, not Israelis, Jews. There were many articles to that effect. The Wall Street Journal, chaos as U.S. Embassy opens. You can see here, world slams disproportionate force in Gaza. The New York Times blared a headline, Israelis killed dozens in Gaza, over a smaller picture of Ivanka Trump pointing to the dedication plaque at the embassy in Jerusalem. There were a number of editorials that were written. They were quite stunning in the New York Times. The first one was called Mr. Trump's Failure in Jerusalem. Look at what this one says. But on Monday, President Trump delivered the embassy as a gift without concession or condition to the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu and as a blow to the Palestinians. The world did not witness a new dawn of peace and security for two peoples who have dreamed of both for so long. Instead, it watched as Israeli soldiers shot and killed scores of Palestinian protesters and wounded thousands more along Israel's boundary with the Gaza Strip. Mr. Trump's announcement that he was recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the embassy from Tel Aviv swept aside 70 years of American neutrality. The ceremony on Monday marking the embassy opening could hardly have been more dismissive of Palestinians. And then they went into the fact that Dr. Jeffress and also John Hagee prayed at the ceremony. Two Christians. How dare they invite Christians to pray at this? The fact that Robert Jeffress, a Dallas pastor who has denigrated Jews, Mormons, and Muslims, and the Reverend John Hagee, a megachurch televangelist who has claimed Hitler was descended from half-breed Jews and was part of God's plan to return Jews to Israel, had prominent roles in the ceremony, should embarrass all who participated. But the contrast on Monday between exultation in Jerusalem and the agony of Palestinians in Gaza could not have been more stark or more chilling to those who continue to hope for a just and durable peace. Look at what the New York Daily News did. Daddy's little ghoul. Bloody disgrace. There were even pictures posted of Ivanka Trump covered in blood as she pointed to the plaque that named her father, this being the embassy being dedicated during the administration of her father. Even Republicans or former Republicans were quick to speak out. Here's Joe Scarborough on Morning Joe, who was a Republican congressman, and from what I remember of him historically, was a supporter of Israel. Look at what he said.
Nika, for the rest of the world, you actually saw an administration, a White House, and we'll say it since Ivanka Trump was there, a family completely out of touch with the realities of the region that they're dealing with. And, you had 55 people killed yesterday? 58. And you had a split screen of what looked like a VIP tent at the Belmont Stakes. And they don't care. Seemed totally oblivious to what was going on, not so far away.
Well, it's stunning that they said this. I'm sure that Joe and Mika spent the week dressed in sackcloth and ashes. They didn't go out to dinner. They could barely leave their fancy apartment in New York to go and do their show. It's a stunning display of hypocrisy and the just rabid hatred for the president. Michelle Goldberg wrote another editorial that the same day as the editorial that I just referenced, called "A Grotesque Spectacle in Jerusalem." Before I read you a little bit of that, I want to share with you what Steve Schmidt said. He's a Republican strategist. He was a senior strategist for John McCain's presidential campaign in 2008. And I want you to listen to what he says about what happened in Jerusalem that day.
MSNBC contributor and Republican strategist Steve Schmidt. Do you trust, Steve, that the president and his staff have thought through what they're doing as they are now juggling three incredibly difficult issues: North Korea, Iran, and Israel, as we saw today?
Of course not, Chris. It's all about U.S. domestic politics. Everything we will see Donald Trump do from now until the midterms to try to stave off a disastrous midterm election defeat is try to intensify support in his base through policies of incitement. And so when we saw the two theocratic nutjob preachers at the crossroads of civilization and religion be able to antagonize Judaism, Catholicism, Islam, and Mormonism all in the same day because of their previous bigoted pronouncements, their extreme ideology, this is not about making the Middle East more secure. It's not about making the United States more secure. It's not about making sure that we don't have yet another generation of American kids dying in Middle Eastern wars. It's all about Donald Trump being able to score a point, ephemeral though it may be in the news cycle, and to position himself for the midterm elections. It's clear as day that he has no sense of history. He's completely ignorant of the religions and the region. Do you think that he could tell you the origins of the Sunni-Shia schism? I suspect not. He knows nothing about anything. He's bumbling around, and he destabilized with this rash move the Middle East. And as I said, when he announced the move to the embassy, I said there will be blood on his hands, not because he pulled the trigger, but because he destabilized the region with not having any clue about what he was doing, and that goes for Jared Kushner as well.
I want to just, you mentioned Robert Jeffress, who is one of the pastors who gave an invocation today. This is what Mitt Romney had to say about him. Robert Jeffress says, "You can't be saved by being a Jew, and Mormonism is a heresy from the pit of hell." He said the same about Islam. "Such a religious bigot should not be giving the prayer that opens the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem." John Hagee also giving an invocation today.
Well, you can see that it's just everybody that opposes Israel is just completely unhinged, and it's only magnified because of their hatred for President Trump. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing to watch. It's shocking the things that were said this week, especially in light of the fact that just to the north, 150 miles maybe, Syrian forces have been pounding the Yarmouk refugee camp in Damascus essentially into oblivion. This is from the front page of this morning's May 21st Jerusalem Post. Amid scenes labeled apocalyptic and crime against humanity, the Syrian regime continued its offensive on Sunday to retake the Palestinian refugee camp of Yarmouk, a neighborhood in South Damascus. Most of the areas held by Islamic State and tens of thousands of Palestinian residents fled years ago, but thousands remain under a brutal siege. The scenes from Yarmouk on Sunday look like Stalingrad in 1942, or I think that's Berlin in 1945. During the Second World War, bombed out buildings as far as the eye can see, roads turned to rubble, alleyways turned into canyons of destruction, gutted, gray, and slumping from airstrikes. There doesn't appear to be anything left of many city blocks that were once a thriving community, the home of more than 200,000 people in 2011 when the Syrian civil war broke out. Now only a few thousand remain. Those who do are reported to be starving under the regime's siege. But even if you completely dismiss the Palestinian right of return, well, this is Michelle Goldberg's article. Listen, a comment about what Assad is doing. Now, look, I know Assad is doing that because he's trying to save his regime, and there were ISIS enclaves in Yarmouk refugee camp area. The report later today was that everybody had been, all the ISIS fighters have been cleared out. We'll see if that's true. But the fact of the matter is that for 70 years, whatever they said about Trump overturning everything, there hasn't been peace for 70 years. There has been, I could list for you time after time after time again, where the Palestinians engaged in 2 intifadas, terrorist attacks. They murdered the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. Time after time after time, there has not been peace. And for people to come out and say that Donald Trump is the one that struck the match, that burned the air, that started everything on fire, is simply untrue. It was under the administration of Barack Obama when the so-called Arab Spring began. This is nonsense. But listen to what Michelle Goldberg says: a grotesque spectacle in Jerusalem. But even if you completely dismiss the Palestinian right of return, it hardly excuses the Israeli military's disproportionate violence. I'm not sure what proportionate violence is. Even before Trump, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu helped open a partisan divide on Israel and American politics, where previously there had been stultifying unanimity. Until these past few years, you'd never heard the word occupation or settlements or talk about Gaza. Jeremy Ben-Ami, president of the liberal pro-Israel group J Street, said of American politicians. This is just absolutely, the disconnect from reality of Michelle Goldberg is shocking. And Ben-Ami, J Street is a left-wing organization. They're rabid supporters of the two-state solution. But Ben-Ami told me that since 2015, when Netanyahu tried to undercut President Barack Obama with a controversial address to Congress opposing the Iran deal, Democrats have felt more emboldened. That changed the calculus forever, he told me. Trump has empowered what's worst in Israel, and as long as he is president, it may be that Israel can kill Palestinians, demolish their homes, and appropriate their land with impunity. This has been going on before the State of Israel came into existence 70 years ago. This is just a stunning lack of ignorance of history and being driven by a left-wing political agenda. She continues, but someday Trump will be gone. With hope for a two-state solution nearly dead, current trends suggest that a Jewish minority will come to rule over a largely disenfranchised Muslim majority in all the land under Israel's control. A rising generation of Americans may see an apartheid state with a Trump Square in its capital and wonder why it's supposed to be our friend. Just absolutely shocking. But the thing that really upset people were the fact that Christians were involved in this. And this is an article from the left-wing Haaretz newspaper in Israel. What happens when pro-Trump Christians weaponize the Bible? It says, look at the subtext under the headline. U.S. pro-Israel evangelicals who declared the president enacted God's will by moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem may want to consider the terrible historical cost of a selective and literalist use of the Bible. The fact that Dr. Jeffress closed his prayer in Jesus' name was very upsetting to them. There was a bunch of articles that continued on this theme. Israeli appeal to evangelicals stirs backlash. Growing alliance risks polarizing U.S. Jews. This is stuff that's been going on for decades. There's already been a polarization. What happened this week is being used for political purposes. Steve Schmidt wants to say it's Trump doing it for political purposes. When the left accuses you of doing something, you know that they're the ones who are doing it themselves. It is horrible what happened down in Gaza. I'll admit this. Mitt Romney, people should remember what he said in his tweet, which I shared with you. Look at what even the Jerusalem Post said: part Shoal outing, revival meeting, and campaign rally. This is what from the New York Times. But the contrast on Monday between exaltation in Jerusalem and the agony of Palestinians in Gaza could not have been more stark or more chilling to those who continue to hope for a just and durable peace. Absolutely stunning. The Arab press was filled, the Arab news from Saudi Arabia, the National from the United Arab Emirates was filled with articles about how the Gazans have been treated like animals. By the way, this dust up over the comments that the president made about the MS-13 gang members and calling them, referring to them as animals. It was shocking. I mean, I have low expectations for people like Nancy Pelosi, but they even exceeded my low expectations by quite a bit this week when they appeared to come out in support of of MS-13. President Trump was very specific as to who he was talking about. They then tried to turn it in that he was talking about all Arabs. Now, there was meetings at the UN about what happened in Gaza. There was this report on ABC, Why Palestinians Throw Stones, a reporter's notebook. Look at what she says in this article. It's absolutely stunning. Indeed, the act of throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers has become a symbolic act of defiance. Throwing a rock is not a symbolic act of defiance. It is an act of defiance, but it is a physical assault, can be a deadly physical assault. And it says, in resistance for the Palestinians, the juxtaposition between boys and men armed with stones against the Israeli military has drawn comparisons to biblical foes David and Goliath. And again, this person demonstrates their historical biblical ignorance by noting or failing to note that David used one stone to kill Goliath. She continues, like the keffiyeh, the checkered Arab scarf that Palestinians sometimes use as a shield against tear gas and to hide their identities, the stone has become a symbol of their struggle. Nikki Haley spoke very eloquently, I think, and forcefully at the United Nations, and this is what she had to say. This is just a few-second clip.
No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has.
And she continued on that theme. And then they introduced the Palestinian representative to speak. You can see the video in the upper left-hand corner. And as he began to speak down there in the lower right-hand corner, Nikki Haley got up and walked out of the room. I won't go into it in detail. Caroline Glick has a very good article about the Israeli response on the Gaza border. She thinks it needs to be much stronger than it has been, because as long as what she terms sort of tepid response is engaged in by Israel, it's only going to get worse. Congressman Ron DeSantis has introduced a resolution in the Congress to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And boy, people are really losing it over this. Now I'm going to take just a quick look at a couple things in the Middle East. I'm going to abbreviate this a little bit, but there was a meeting a week ago, or almost 2 weeks ago now, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin in Russia. There have been some interesting developments after that. This was in Haaretz the other day, also in the Gulf News. After the meeting with Assad also met in Sochi, Russia, with Vladimir Putin. Following that meeting, Putin let it be known that he wanted formed forces he said they would start leaving. The Gulf News reported it as Russia wants Iran and Hezbollah out of Syria. I think this is a significant development, and I think it may play into a passage of Bible prophecy. I want you to look at a little bit of this clip of Erdogan in Turkey. We haven't heard too much about him for the last couple of weeks, but he also used this opportunity to shore up his base in the Islamic world about how he was a big supporter of the Palestinian cause, and he gave a speech at a large rally in Ankara last Friday. Here's just a little bit from that. You'll have to listen to the translator.
We have gathered here to commemorate the Mecca where our Kaaba is located, and in Medina where people are mourning for their loss in the fight against Israel. Our soldiers and their families in Gaza, in Palestine, I salute them with affection, and I am sending my condolences for any soldiers who have lost their lives in this sacred fight, in this sacred objection. My brothers, do you know that Jerusalem is not only a city? Jerusalem is a symbol as well. It is an examination. Jerusalem is our Qibla. If we fail to protect our first Qibla, how shall we determine the future of our latest Qibla? I have to be honest with you. The world of Islam is going through an examination of Jerusalem, and I regret to say that we are failing.
Inshallah.
Hopefully, inshallah, it will come soon. And it's not only the Islamic world, but for the whole humanity. They have failed, we have failed in this examination. My brothers, our poem says that first they invaded the Jerusalem, which is in our hearts, and we lost this war between ourselves. As the Muslims, ever since the Jerusalem within our hearts was occupied, we started to fail to fight against it. The Ottoman Empire for 4 centuries held Jerusalem and accepted it as the peaceful symbol of all sacred religions. The Ottoman Empire, who was defeated in the First World War, lost Jerusalem along with many other cities. Jerusalem, hopefully, will be the reason of the salvation of all Muslim folks. The issue of Jerusalem is equally important for us. In this fight for Jerusalem, we will be proud to lead the Muslims. Today, I would like to commemorate again our Palestinian brothers who are continuously fighting against Israel. And I am inviting all the Muslims in the world to resurrect, to awaken from their dreams, to stand up and to stand against to the threat for the humanity that's done by Israel. This is unfair. This is unjust. And we have to act upon this.
Well, it's interesting what he did there was he said that Jerusalem was a test for Muslims. It was an examination, and would they pass the test? And he also essentially said that the issue of Jerusalem was central to peace for mankind. Now, given the location of the country in which he stands, Turkey, and I believe its significance in the end times. This was a very, very significant speech that Erdogan gave in Istanbul. You will see some of the images there of one of the giant mosques in Istanbul behind him as he was speaking at this rally. That speech was shortly followed by a meeting of the Organization of Islamic Conference or Cooperation. They had what they called an extraordinary summit in Istanbul on Friday. Leaders of many of the Muslim countries, the 57 countries that belong to that, were there. There were speeches by Erdogan, by King Abdullah of Jordan, and by Prime Minister Rouhani of, not Prime Minister, President Rouhani of Iran. Here's just another clip of Erdogan comparing the Israelis for the way they were treating people in Gaza to what the Nazis did to Jews in Germany. And then also I'll have a couple comments when he's done about the speech by President Rouhani and King Abdullah.
There is no difference between the cruelty inflicted against the Jews 75 years ago in Europe and the one that our brothers in Gaza are facing now. The children of those being subjected to all sorts of torture in concentration camps during World War II are now attacking Palestinians with methods that would make Nazis turn green with envy.
Rouhani said that in his speech that essentially all nations need to cut economic ties with both Israel and the United States. And then King Abdullah in his speech, now he's often touted as someone who's on very favorable terms with Israel, said this: "Let me stress once again that our region will never enjoy comprehensive peace unless the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is resolved according to international law and relevant United Nations resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative." Again, this demonstrates that there are many initiatives. We have the Quartet, we have UN resolutions, we have the Arab Peace Initiative. There are many peace initiatives that are out there. If these are part of or form the basis of the covenant, maybe that they all come into play at the same time, and they're all sort of, I think, forced on Israel. And I think that will have some impact on the ability to identify at that time who this man of peace, who the Antichrist really is. Continuing with what Abdullah said in his speech, His Majesty said in his speech that the king, who returned to Jordan later today, called for immediate measures by brotherly Arab and Muslim countries to support the perseverance of Palestinians and empower them economically while countering attempts to Judaize Jerusalem and alter its Arab, Islamic, and Christian identity. So it seems that the die is cast. There were also other people there that I think are significant. There were Pakistan and Afghanistan, which historically had formed part of some of the Persian empires that have existed over time. It was a stunning meeting. It was, I think, very important from a prophetic standpoint, and it kind of relates a little bit to the Iran deal. Let me explain what I mean. Trump withdrawing from the Iranian deal, what has happened was that there was a bunch of European countries that were canceling contracts. The EU has now stepped in, and along with the UK, by the way, Boris Johnson, the foreign minister of the UK at this time, and said that European companies cannot stop to do business with Iran. So there's really a tremendous amount of conflict, but it's having a huge impact on Iran. There was a report just today in Ynet News that Europe, China, Russia are discussing a new deal for Iran. Everybody wants to make peace with the Iranians. Everybody wants to keep them in this deal. But the result of that has been that Iran is in a major economic crisis. Their currency is dropping in value. They had inflation of, I think, 35% in the last month. And so how this exactly plays out, I don't know. Let me just suggest one thing. I would encourage you to go read the 8th chapter of Daniel. Now, a lot of people think that Daniel has already been fulfilled. I used to lean that way. I don't lean that way anymore. I think that Daniel is a prophecy. Daniel 8 is a prophecy for the end times. And it talks about the ram and the goat. And this goat comes from the west very quickly against the ram. The ram clearly represents Persia, in the area of Persia. I think the goat may represent Turkey. I think that, and I've talked about this a little bit over the past couple of months, that I perceive that there's a conflict coming between Turkey and Iran. I think is something that might happen before an Ezekiel 38 war. I don't think it's something that a lot of people consider, but you have seen Erdogan and Turkey rise to power in a relatively short period of time. Remember, it was less than 2 years ago that they had, at least they appear to have had, an attempted coup that he was able to put down. He's jailed thousands of people, fired thousands of people, teachers, military people, government workers. He's engaged in just a massive purge. He's completely taken control of the media. He has essentially risen, I think, in some respects to a status approaching, if not beyond, that of Ataturk, who created, was considered to be the father of modern Turkey following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. Erdogan built a 900-room palace in Ankara that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. He has portrayed himself as a sultan. And it does talk about this at the end times. There's this goat that comes quickly from the east, or from the west, attacking Persia in the east. Let me just see if I can find here. The ram, okay, see verse 4 of Daniel chapter 8. The ram, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Now this is what exactly the direction that Iran, Persia, the ram, has been pushing over the last several years. They've been pushing northward, southward, and westward towards Syria. They've been creating that Shia corridor, Shia crescent, from the Persian Gulf all the way up through Syria to the Mediterranean. Now, I'm not saying this is being fulfilled right now, but I'm just saying it does talk about a conflict that comes between Persia, the ram, and this goat that comes from the west. Now, there's a lot of different views as to who this goat coming from the west is. Some think it comes from Europe, some think it's America, some think that it's Turkey. So I'm just bringing it up so that you pay attention to what is going on. Look at what it says here. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. So it talks about this conflict that's going to take place between the goat, could be Turkey, could be somebody else, but Turkey, I think, is definitely a possibility, something that we should pay attention to, and Persia. I don't think there's any question who the ram is. It represents Persia. Now, some people think that this prophecy has been fulfilled. I personally don't think. I think it deserves a futuristic interpretation. There is a verse in here, so let me, if I can find it here in Daniel. Okay. A lot of people say, well, it was fulfilled by Alexander the Great, and because it talks about Greece, but I think the word there that is interpreted Greece in some of these visions really relates more to Western Turkey, which is the area of the powerful area of Turkey today. And look at what it says in verse 17. A lot of people say, well, it had to have happened before, but it says here, so he came near where I stood. This is the angel comes to explain to Daniel what the vision was about. And when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O Son of Man, for at that time of the end shall be the vision. And verse 19, and he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. So I think it's just something that we need to pay attention to. I think it's a fairly significant development, the weakening of Iran at the same time. And just one more thing, and I'll be finished with this. And my 30-minute update I see has now exceeded 1 hour. This reports out in the last day that the White House will announce its Mideast peace plan after Ramadan ends in June. That's the Muslim holy month. And so this peace plan is supposed to be released. There's a lot of speculation as to what it will entail. I do note that in his speech, Jared Kushner, who is one of the members of the president's team on this particular issue, essentially said that people are going to have to give up something. Now, what exactly that means, what they're going to propose, I don't know. We'll have to see and watch this. We'll pick up more in the future on this Daniel 8 theme and some of these other topics. I also want to remind you that on June 9th, Randy Smith, pastor in Sebring, Florida, who goes to Israel a number of times each year, and I will be doing a one-day conference on Israel, because this is the 70th anniversary, and that will be the main theme of that conference. It's one day. It starts about 9 o'clock in the morning, goes till around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's no charge. If you want to attend live, you can register you go to Fellowship Bible Chapel website, fbchapel.com. There's a link to register with Eventbrite, just so we have an idea as to how many people are coming. Again, it's no cost, and it will also be live streamed. So take care, and I will talk to you again next Sunday.